So welcome everybody to the We Are All Connected series. It's a great pleasure to be continuing this series. We got a great start with Caprice the last time, and now we're continuing with the series. And we will start today with a prayer by Pat Taliber.
Okay. I'm just going to give a little introduction here, if that's all right, Luann?
Yes.
Before I do prayer? Okay. In one of Tania's posts, she shares in a quote, if in your statement for diversity, she says, we welcome diverse employees. You need to revise that language, she says. We don't want to be welcomed. We want to be valued. So today I value each of you. To the second in the pilot series, We Are All Related. And I especially want to thank Tania and Luann for arranging this time together for us. And as Tania says, she focuses on moving dreams to goals and desires to results. We Are All Related series provides opportunities to deepen relationships with people of diverse populations, cultures, and backgrounds as stepping stones to establishing connections with various speakers and valuing their wisdom and their journey. Today is a time to be present, to listen, and to reflect. I will begin now with a centering time for us, just a short time. And after this, Luann, Susie, and I thought it would be important to share with you again how this series came about. Then Luann will introduce our speaker for today. Following the introduction, Tania will share her journey and reflections on our directional statement, too. Her sharing will be followed by a question and answer period, which will be facilitated by Luann. And Susie will close our time together with a reading. So let's begin. Let's take a couple of deep breaths, healing breaths in and out. Now I invite you to take a few minutes of quiet reflection on the phrase, we are all related. Intuit for yourself its meaning and the breath it holds in walking your path. Gently holding what you've received in your reflection. Now, how did this series come to be? Colleen McGinnity's Zoom conference on directional statement number 2 came with the hope for action. It was during this discussion that I suggested how wonderful it would be to invite others to share with us their insights on this statement. Susie offered to join me in brainstorming how this might happen. And Luann, of course, heard about our discussion and asked to join in the planning. So last month, our first speaker was Caprice Jones, founder of the Fountain of Youth program in Dubuque. Today is the second in this series of this series. And at the assembly, we will have a panel discussion with others sharing with us insights on directional statement number 2. We intend to continue this series quarterly during the coming year. So here we are today with Tania. Luann will now introduce her, followed by question and answer period. And Susie will close our time together this afternoon with a reading.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming. And I'd especially like to welcome Tania, who so generously is giving her time this afternoon. A very busy person. Tania is fairly well known among BVM circles. She graduated from Fundación Nuevo Mundo. She was actually my student there, where I recognized her extraordinary intellect and talent and passion. And then Tania was able to attend Clark, which is now Clark University. And as if you read her bio, you can see that she's been up to a few things since then. She, so it is a great pleasure to welcome Tania. I think, Tania, you will say more things about yourself as you give your talk. And I love Tania like a daughter. We haven't been in very much touch lately, but it's so great to see you again, Tania, and welcome.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, this is when you introduce me like that, I'm gonna get all emotional right away. So here you go. Yeah, I really am very happy to be here with you this afternoon. I think this opportunity really kind of brings my journey full circle in a lot of different ways over the last 2.5 years. And yeah, I wouldn't be here without Luann and you all. So I really appreciate everything in this opportunity. So I thought I start today, instead of starting where I started with my life, I'll start where I am. And then in the spirit of we are all connected, share with you how in my ways, everything feels related and connected, particularly this concept of inequities and equality and justice, how it feels not necessarily a unique problem in any part of the world, but a problem that is worldwide, and how my experiences in the different stages of life show the challenges that we face. And so my work towards this journey professionally of I guess I can use the word fighting in this circle, fighting towards a more equitable society really started from the professionally speaking in 2013. I here in Madison, Wisconsin, the Race to Equity report was released, and the Race to Equity report is a report that highlights how Wisconsin is the worst for Black people to live. And while the report focuses on Black people, it also created an opportunity for other communities to get involved and talk about the illnesses that we face. And I was very involved in the Latino community at the time, volunteering as the treasurer on the boards of a couple nonprofit organizations. It's like if you have a CPA and you treasure, everybody wants to recruit you to be treasurer. So I allowed myself to be recruited in a couple of those nonprofits and was treasurer. And so I was very involved in the Latino community. And at the same time, it's that 12 of us founded the Latino Professionals Associations, which focus was to retain Latino talent here in Madison, Wisconsin. And at the time, I was very naive, I guess is the right word to use, about like the challenges and the nuances and the history of how all these things have come to be, but was very curious and was very motivated to, I guess, invest my time and my efforts into it. At the same time, I had my first child, Alexandra, which she's now 9 years old, but if it was 2013. and the I became more aware about the gender inequality and gender inequities and how I had faced them through my life. And I think that in having a daughter, it really kind of pushed me to rethink about the gender inequalities. So it was all those things kind of, finding myself in the middle of all these talks and all these people just highlighting the pain of inequality, the number of people that are in jail, the number of people that do not graduate from high school, the number of people that cannot access healthcare, the number of people that are dying too young. And that was what the Race to Equity report was all about. And so going to work was interesting at the time because I guess I was in a very, people weren't comfortable talking about these things. So it was interesting that we would spend so much time outside of work talking about these, what I call symptoms of inequality, but really couldn't get into the places and spaces to talk about the sources of these inequities, which in my thought process at the time was, well, people can't pay for their kids to have after school, or can't pay for daycare, or can't pay for doctor appointments because they don't have work or they don't get paid enough, or they don't have businesses or capital or any of those things. And so to me, it felt like if we're not talking about how people are treated at work and why they don't have access to work or don't have the opportunity to earn a living, and they don't have the investments in them to overcome the challenges that they have, then how are we going to solve this? It's just like this vicious cycle of just, inequity after inequity after inequity. And so me and a couple other people created Step Up for Equity, which is basically to bring this discussion about inequities into the workplace. And so it started very informal, I would say, in terms of we did a focus group of business owners and business people to ask them why they were not talking about these topics in the workplace and what was keeping them from taking action and all of those things. And so we did that for about 2 years and did trainings, and there was a lot of learnings in there, and a lot of, for me particularly, as somebody who didn't grow up here, and I think just swimming in these places where, I was working with Latinos who were second generation Latinos, and they were struggling with their identity, working with a Black organization here in town, Black Women, and being in corporate America. And so it was all these places that didn't always make sense at that time. And in 2016, a young Black man was murdered here in Madison by the police. And so it was all these interesting events in my life. And so in the way that we did our training, the way that we had our discussions were taking traction. And so people starting to ask us to come and do this work in their organizations. And in 2016 or 2017, we were contracted to do a consulting agreement to have the company have all these discussions, and it was 13 of them in like 4 months. And the reason I'm sharing this because this was really a turning point for me. I was doing the work of facilitating these discussions, but it happened like once a quarter. It was my commitment. And when these started to, I did this for 13 of them in 3 months, it really shook me in ways that I was not prepared to manage, or it was really challenging. And the context in there is that this company is a construction company. It has 746 employees. That is white male. The entire leadership team is white male. It has a very male-dominated tone to the culture. The women who work in the engineering roles was just it's a very small number. And then in the field too, so there was also this combination of blue collar and white collar trainings and facilitating of working, and they had this very interesting history of like having one Black person who had been a Mason for 40 some years, and they would really like wear that as a badge of honor of some sorts. And so it's just like all these things, and I remember being in one of the sessions, and one of the women who was white also, it was kind of, she had been holding all these things in her body, and when we did the session, it kind of just came all out. And one of the other persons thought that people became angry, physically and visibly angry about having these discussions and sessions. And so it took a lot of emotional labor on me to not lose my cool in these sessions either, and just do my job. But the accumulation of of doing 13 of them within 4 months really built up in me in ways that I was not aware, and so I kind of had to take a whole year off after that from doing this work, because it was a little more than I can manage, and it took a lot of work for me to have hope in the world again, because I think when you bring some of the challenges and you say, here is the inequities that exist, we are here to do this work, and then people react in ways that are angry or defensive or guilt or whatever it is, and it becomes about their ailments and not about the thing that we were about to work anyways. It just makes you lose a lot of hope, and it was just very challenging. And in this contract, I was also working with a Black woman, and so on the one side I had these construction workers who were telling me these things, and then on the other side I have a Black woman who actually comes from Virginia, and she has educated me a lot on the history of slavery, and it's the first time, Virginia is the first time when slavery happened, and so it was just a drastic change. Not drastic, it's just the being in the middle of these and managing those relationships was very hard, in the sense of ask myself, how do you exist in these spaces in a way that it doesn't absorb your soul in ways that makes you ineffective, or I guess oblivious, or it's easy to just want to live in the bubble and ignore these things. And so, but I also couldn't in a way sacrifice myself in this process for the sake of training people that were not ready to be trained. And so I took a whole year off to help myself process all all the little things that happen in this particular experience of facing white and Black America really in a very big way, and then also feeling like they were using Latinos in their office as an out, um, and that they will say something along the lines of like, we like Latino workers because they work really hard, and say something along the lines of like, Black people are lazy or but like it was just so very open and very there in your face. And so, and I share all of that because it's, I think, part of the work that we have to do when we are in relationship and inequality is actually a lot of emotional intelligence. And so I spent a whole year learning and practicing and getting my skills up for the emotional intelligence, understanding how I'm feeling when I'm ready, and then helping other people, because this work of fighting for justice and fighting for to erase inequalities and remove barriers and make ways for people is very emotional, and it's particularly emotional when you can relate to the journey that people go through. And so when people say things like the ones that they say, they don't understand that they're saying those things about yourself or your family or people who you care very deeply about. And so in that process, then what we learned to do was to bring in the emotional skills training for people. And I still have to do a lot of that today when we're doing this work. And because the level of injustice that we feel that we're seeing in the world is maybe it's always there and it's always been there, or like my husband said when he's like it's always been there, it's just now in the open because of everything that is things. So like, you know, to make me feel better, he's like, it's not that we're getting worse. It's not, it's just that now we have we're being forced to make a choice. We're being forced because everything is out in the open. We're being forced about who we want to be and how we want to leave the world for others. And that's not because we're going backwards as a society. It's that we are opening or peeling the onion to see the things about the society that we might have felt good about in the past that are not so good after all. And now we have to make a choice about how we want to move our way forward through that. And as I advanced my skills through this work, I did decide 2.5 years ago to just do this on a more full-time basis. So now, instead of taking my vacation to go do these trainings, I can do them when I'm doing my work. And it is one of the most rewarding, I guess, experiences I have, in the sense of seeing people understand their positional and societal power and how they can make different choices and how they can think about things a little bit outside the box and not within the same policies and contexts and systems. It really like makes me happy. You know, I can go back and say there were policies changed in this particular organization, and we're going to change a program because we understand it differently. And one of those part of this rewarding effect of utilizing my intelligence, like Luan said, and my skills and my talent to also build the leadership of people of color and women of color particularly. And so, for example, the Foundation for Black Women's Wellness, which started in 2012, was born because my dear friend and CEO and the same woman that I spoke about earlier, Lisa Page and Kerr, she lost her mom at 62. Her mom was 62 when her mom died. And it was at that time where she realized that this was a pattern in her life, that her aunts and her friends and her people that she knew, and she grew up in a hair salon, shampooing in a hair salon. So people that she had shampooed her life, all her life, they were dying a lot early before she was ready to lose them, I guess. And so she in her grief started to research this and then learned that Black women die, average age of death is 60 and 62, depending on the which state. In particular, in Wisconsin, is like the worst for Black women's health. And so she started to elevate that as a health risk here in Wisconsin. And for me, it's really rewarding that in these last 3 years that I've been working with her on this, which was a very grassroots founded kind of organization, now is a organization, a nonprofit organization of 13. And they're doing the work of giving people access to services. And for example, there is this study that shows that if you have a doula as a Black woman, your chances of death and the chances of the child to live are a lot higher for a lot of reasons, a lot of racism in healthcare, a lot of lack of sources. And so a doula really changes the experience of a Black woman who gives birth in any place, but particularly here in Wisconsin, which has the worst outcomes for women, Black women. And so that for me shows these things that I have always believed about inequality, that is not a outcome of lack of talent or not an outcome of lack of capacity, but it's an outcome of lack of investment and lack of opportunities and lack of access. And that when we focus on changing the lack of access and opportunity, that really the outcomes the outcomes fix themselves. And I think that really was ingrained in me, I think, through my high school education, really, because this was Tania's and Patricia's path idea, right? When they started Nuevo Mundo, was that high quality education should not be something that is only accessible to people with a lot of wealth. That good education should be accessible to all of us. And so I think I personally had benefited from that process, that thought process, that is not a lack of talent and is not a lack of people's desire to overcome and work hard, but it's a lack of investments and a lack of resources. And then similarly, at the same time, I've been working with the Indian Country Today News, which is a national or nonprofit organization that covers the news in the Indian country in the US. And actually now they're moving outside of the US to Canada and New Zealand too. And that has been very transformational in the sense of understanding how just the fact that this organization exists is an act of perseverance, if like we understand the history of indigenous people, that they were meant to be erased, but their persistence and their resilience really kept them on this earth. And so it's just beautiful to watch or see the news that are produced by all indigenous journalists in their story, and just experience also an indigenous culture work. So when I work with them, is really centered or grounded on indigenous principles. And so it's been very transformational for me, because I think I spent my first journey of my career in a very white-centric, Eurocentric culture, and didn't really quite understand what that meant, or how that was different than like working in a very in the Black or in the all Black nonprofit, for example, or in these all indigenous or all Latino. And so now that I spend so much time navigating and experiencing these spaces, I can see all the differences in the culture and the way that people talk, and the way that people conduct themselves, and in the way that they have centered justice and working towards that better equality and equity in the world. And so when I was reading your statement on inequality, I was very aligned with a lot of the words that you choose. And I think I appreciated the ways in which you recognize some of the embedded contextually ideas that make it so that organizations and communities that have been born out of Catholicism or Christianity have a great deal of inequities within themselves. And that has been a very hard journey for me in terms of my, how I was raised in religion. I was raised in a country, or in Latin America, is 80% Catholic, with Catholicism has been the center of our society in a lot of ways. Is the ways that we Latinos find a lot of, I would say, solace. It's like, if you think about our culture, it says, vaya con Dios, or if God wants, si Dios quiere, or, there is a lot of comfort that comes from having that grounding in that faith of, in particular, Catholicism and Christianity. And so it's been, that part of this journey has been very challenging for me, because again, like when you think about it, Christianity and Catholicism has embedded inequities in themselves, and particularly when it comes to gender and gender roles. And so it's been we talk in the work that there is a lot of unlearning, because we were socialized and educated in a certain way. And in order to imagine a different way of living, we have to actually unlearn what we had originally thought it was expected of us. And so I bring that into my work as well. And, rethinking about the socialization of gender, of sexual identity, and how that affects people. And I remember one time and being in one of these trainings and channeling one of my experiences from Ecuador with these with gender and Catholicism, and thinking about, as I walked through the streets or in Ecuador and there were people who identified as homosexuals, people saying something along the lines of, we're going to say a prayer for them, because at that time, these adults believed that if you did not identify as heterosexual, there was something wrong with you, and therefore there was a prayer that you needed to say for that person. And that just was a aha moment that I had, that like really probably spent a whole month sitting with it, because it's really, when you really think about it, it's super sad, and how unaccepted somebody must feel when they feel like an entire society sees them as something that they can't control, or something that they are is not, it's something that's wrong with them. And so that was a complete reframing and the suffering that happens through that. And it reminded me how painful that was for one of my closest friends in high school to experience that very directly. And at the time I wasn't with it to understand all these complexities, but I saw it. I saw the suffering up and close. And so it was very challenging to like have these aha moments, like, wow, like this is really something that we do to people. And so I feel like a lot of the suffering that I have seen or experienced comes from these gender inequities, and gender, I guess, prioritizing men over women. And it's something that happens in the Latino culture all over the world, including in the US. And it's great I have a lot of friends who are second generation Latinas, and one of the things that we've talked about is how the expectations that are placed on Latina women in the US are always more work than the Latino men, and that Latino men and boys are protected or cared for or tended for or nurtured, while the women are very socialized to serve, to work, to provide, to be to be the foundation and the strength of their homes. And that's something that is something that I have had to unlearn on my own, in terms of what we're socialized. And in thinking about these injustices is also something that my mother felt, these gender inequalities. And I remember her raising us and telling us that she didn't make us do laundry or do all these things because she didn't want to teach us, so we wouldn't be a good wives, because the expectation in Latin America is if you're a good wife, you are like cooking and you're cleaning and you're doing laundry and you're doing all these things for your husband. And my mother was very determined to not train us to do that. And so going back to this place of why these roles are very intricate into the Christianity and Catholicism that Latin America lives with. And it really comes out of from a lot of that. And so that's why when I was looking at your statement, it really made me smile. You know, that it has that level of awareness that I wish more places that I work with had, about recognizing the historical accumulation of these inequalities and the need to repair, and the need to change them, and how there is always people who may experience injustice more than what ones have, and utilize how we have our whatever I call it societal power or level of influence to like make the change that we need to make. I want to check time because I don't know when you wanted to do questions. So I have a couple other things I like to share, but I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough time for questions.
So we have about 18 minutes, Tanya. So I think you can finish up what you want to say, and then we'll get some questions.
All right. So I talked a little bit about suffering and how doing this work has augmentating my level of suffering, not because I am myself putting in harm ways or anything like that. I don't want to say that, but just the suffering for the injustices that we see in the world, and so that has forced me to also think about healing, forgiving, and compassion. And so those are in order to work in this justice world, it's important for me to also center the healing, the forgiving, not just others, but myself, and compassion. And that's the only way that I can stay in it. Because if I don't do any of those three things, then I would just eventually be part of the problem and not be part of the solution. So that's the three things that I wanted to close with, is the importance of, which are part of my faith too. So I think that's why this work is hard, is recognizing how my faith and my context in which I grew created all these things, but they are also the source of the ways that I know how to heal, forgive, and have compassion. And so that's why this is hard. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That talk was expansive and challenging and beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. In terms of questions and interacting with Tanya, if you have a question, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom, or if you don't want to do that, you can raise your hand physically, and I'll be looking out for people who have questions or comments. And the floor is open, and Marilyn is up.
Hi, Tanya. First of all, just to thank you for being here. And thank you for witnessing to the results of what an education can do. Thank you for sharing the struggle, especially when you talked about doing those workshops and confronting direct anger and hate and fear, because I think that's what we all experience, whether personally or institutionally. And so it's always this struggle of how do you bring that compassion and understanding, and how do you dialogue, and how do you continue the conversation? And thank you again for that, because also thank you for the example of stepping away from it, because we need to nourish and regroup, and we need one another to do that, because it can be so overwhelming. I guess I'd like to, the question I have, and I don't expect you necessarily to answer all of it, but the question is, with the upcoming elections, midterms, with the climate of this thing about replacement theories or the conflict. Sometimes it can be so heavy because it seems like, especially on some of the newscasting and some of the way where people are framing all of this. And Rosa, we watch each state. And I was just wondering from your perspective, you bring me hope, but anyway, from your perspective in Wisconsin particularly,
Yeah.
and nationally, and then, again, the hate we experience internationally from dictators around the world, and the hate and the cruelty. But you give me hope because of your connections with other cultures, connections with and getting in touch with, as we all have to, with our own prejudices, our own discrimination. But anyway, I know there's hope, but can you give us any perspective on what you see might be not necessarily actions, but attitudes towards what's coming up for us in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of both on a local level? I know that's a lot, but any perspective you can give would be grateful.
Yeah, thank you. So some days are easy in order to get out there and just do the work, but I think that what always gets me back out is really the idea that I am enjoying these privileges and these freedoms because other people fought in the past, right? Like when I think about when women were allowed to vote and when women were allowed to get their own loan to buy things, and it's not that long ago. It's almost like it's really, when I think in the history of the world, is really a short while ago. And the only reason why we can have these conversations and we can have these now conversations out of the open in the workplace is because there were people that were putting themselves on the line to push people forward. And then the thing that helps me temper my anger or frustration with people who seem to not understand that suffering is painful, or that wherever they're coming from, they're being used and manipulated in certain ways, is really the hope that a personal connection can change the rhetorics outside of the group. I've seen people change not because of a policy or not because of thing, but because they cared about somebody, and that somebody in relationships. I myself have changed in the way that I view and feel what happens with Black Americans and Indigenous Americans, not because I wasn't exposed to those pains before, but because now those pains are not something that I hear in the news. Those pains are the pains of the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis. And so when I was here in Madison and I had they had the shooting of these Black men, I experienced it very differently than when George Floyd was killed. And the reason wasn't because the events changed, it was because my relationships with those people changed. I have very deep friendships with Black women. And so experiences with them versus experiencing in the media are very different things. And so that's what I channel, and gives me the patience some days that if I can focus on building that relationship, then we can talk about issues later. And sometimes there's people who are not going to change. And so I also kind of do that calculated risk of like, is it worth my energy and emotional labor to have this discussion right now? Or do I save it for somebody who may be more open to it?
Thank you, Tania. Marianne?
I think, Tania, that you've already touched on perhaps partially responding to what I want to ask. First of all, I'm thinking just your recent reflection that you did right now. It shows how important it is that we are all related becomes real and personal for us. It's not just an intellectual idea. And even your being here today with your story has made all of this more real and personal for me. I, along with Marilyn, I want to especially thank you for addressing the emotional toll that this takes, and being honest about that, because it's hard to talk about something that affects us at the emotional and the feeling level, and yet that's what makes relationships happen and help us see that we're all related. My question, I was really moved about how things changed for you when you had your daughter. And as you reflect on being with us today and that directional statement, but mostly just being with us, what is it that we can do or be to be companions in hope with you in creating something different for your daughter? Do you have any suggestions for us? I loved your word repair, and maybe that's part of it. And how do we go about that reparation and that repair and being companions in hope?
It's hard to answer that question without knowing you individually, what matters most to you. I will say that the ways in which I try to take my own individual power to do things differently. So when I was, even before I did this work, I will donate directly to nonprofits that were led by women of color, only because 1% of philanthropy goes to nonprofits led by women of color, or less than 1%. And so I think for me, it's understanding how even leaving corporate America was for me part of that decision, because I wanted to, I was basically building wealth of people who were inflicting pain, and not in a direct way, but when really part of the solution either. And so now my expertise, knowledge, and skills is supporting the leadership of Black women, Indigenous women, Latino women. And most of my clients and the financial management consultant area are women of color. And so for me, it was just, where am I showing up, and how am I showing up? And I think that really then opens these connections for relationships, right? I personally, I'm very unique here in Madison that in terms of, there's not a lot of Latino people that spend a lot of time with Black people here, but I didn't want to be part of the problem. And so I showed up for the events, I showed up for volunteering. And so I think it's just showing up. And then I think the rest kind of starts from there, because people then, when you show up consistently for people, then that relationship builds organically. And then your own world starts to change, and you don't even know that it has changed until later. So for me, it's really, to challenge yourself to show up in places and spaces that you had a lot of value, because you have this knowledge of how things work that they might not know. And that was been and just being a bridge for some of these system things are very eye-opening to me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne and Tanya. Any other questions? Elizabeth?
She's muted.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Wait.
Elizabeth, unmute yourself.
Bienvenida, Tania.
Gracias.
Sí, no sé si te acuerdas de mí, pero cuando
Sí,
estaba
sí.
en Guayaquil, sí. Muchas gracias por todo que has dicho esta tarde. We are BVMs are notorious for their desire for research, background information, and then eventually we get around to now we should do something. But we do get around to it. But I would recommend to all of us sitting here. I listen to podcasts. I don't have a lot of time to watch some of these TV shows. But Rachel Maddow last week had an excellent program on the history of white supremacy in the United States, and it undid me to hear the length of time that this white nationalism, white supremacy has just been growing and growing within our country. So it's not something new. It's not just Trump. It's not just, the civil rights movement. So I commend that to you. And then there's an article in the National Catholic Reporter about Catholicism, which Tania touched upon, and white supremacy. And it would be something, I can't remember if it was Sean Winters who wrote it, but it was this past week that was in the online NCR. And then to further support what Tania was saying about gender inequality and also not understanding the role of women in society and many of the burdens that women have to bear, our Archbishop of San Francisco, Bishop Cordileone, has banned communion to Nancy Pelosi. And I was going to call her and say, if you'd like to share communion with us, come on down. You can join us. But I think it's this, what you've brought forward, Tania, is for us to individually really look at this and what can we do, and at what point do we say no more as a religious congregation? No more. And it is hard, I think, as you said, Tania, the emotional struggle for us. We're a women religious Catholic institution. So how do you stand up to, a church that is white? And I'm sure many of us have story after story that we could tell. And so, Tania, gracias por compartiendo con nosotros. I'm grateful that you were here. I hope that others, I'm glad this was recorded, because I would really hope that others of us would listen to this before our assembly. It's so important because, Tania, you represent for us, as Marilyn said earlier, because we have the means, we were able to assist you so that you are the person you are, but I'm so grateful that you've had opportunities that others haven't. So thank you.
Elizabeth, Pat, were you trying to raise your hand or were you clapping?
No, I raised my hand. If I could just take a moment, Luann.
Yes.
I was just, Tania, so aware as you were speaking so vulnerably to us about your emotional challenge. I wish as a community we would engage more and more in listening to people and women of color, or just really listening, because for me, that's the transformational piece. I don't think we do enough of that. And Tania, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your endurance and for your strength. And sometimes I know it must be hard. You don't want to be that kind of woman who's always has to be the strong one. But from my point of view, this is where relationships are built and formed and changes really happen. So miigwech and Gracias. So, so wonderful to meet you. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, that's pretty much all the time we have. I'm wondering, Tanya, if you would like to make a final statement. You mentioned in your talk hope, and it's just, I don't know, from myself personally, at times it's hard to find hope in these times. And I'm wondering if you could make a statement about that as sort of a closing.
Sure. Ooh, hope. So I think I always channel the love that I have received, and then also the love that I give. And so it's this balance between knowing that despite the pain, despite the suffering, and sometimes it feels like it's pain all the time, but also knowing psychologically, we as humans are conditioned to focus on what's not working. And not that we have to look away from what's not working, but I think it's also focusing on the things that are working so that we can continue doing the things that are working. Somebody in one of our trainings said it more beautiful in saying that it's not that we have to change everything that we do, it's that we have to stop the things that should change. Going back to what Elizabeth was saying, is that there's a lot of great things that you have, and it doesn't mean that you have to start from scratch. It just means that we need to say no to certain things that we all are aware now and that we didn't know before. And so for me, the hope is really comes from that place of receiving the imperfect love and giving imperfect love. And I think knowing that it's imperfect is very important.
That was a perfect ending. Thank you, Tanya. So thank you all for coming. And I also hope that many people can see the recording, because this was really a very inspirational talk and exchange. And I want to express my gratitude. Tanya, you've grown into the woman I anticipated you would be and more. So thank you for being who you are in our world that is so much in need. And keep on having a beautiful life.
Thank you, Luann.